We'll actually probably have plenty of time to talk tonight because this is a relatively short lesson. It's a really good one. It is a fun story. The class I taught where Ethan was in, they debated this topic, and the pro team, I felt really bad. They had all the pieces in their argument, but when you're under that pressure where someone's coming back at you, their arguments did kind of fall apart. But they had all the pieces. I was like, no, take this and this and this, and then put it together, and you're there. So it's really fun because much like the argument for God, no one piece really stands on its own. But even more so, like the arguments for God, there's really good ones that even on their own are really strong. The arguments for the resurrection, you really need the whole picture. But when you look at that whole picture, it's really, in my opinion, really solid. So today we're going to talk about the case for the resurrection. And we're going to start with what are the requirements for the reliability or the credibility of a witness. And this largely comes, J. Warner Wallace talks a lot about this, and definitely recommend his site. But this I actually found online, and there are 6 things that are looked at in today's world when you put someone on trial to determine the credibility of a witness. So you've got the demeanor, how the witness looked, acted, and spoke while testifying. A witness who is evasive, hostile, or acting suspiciously may be less credible. Consistency. So again, you may be telling the truth, but if you look squirrely, like you're going to be perceived as lying. Consistency. Whether the witness's statements are consistent when describing events. Memory. How well the witness remembers and describes what happened, even if they can't remember perfectly. They should be confident and honest about what they can remember. Attitude, whether the witness is engaged and ready to tell their story. A witness who seems inconvenienced or doesn't want to testify may not be credible. Bias, whether the witness has a personal relationship with the victim or has been given a special deal by the prosecution. And prior statements, whether the witness has made inconsistent statements about important events in the past. This kind of seems to almost be an echo of consistency to me, but so we're going to take these one at a time, look at the qualifications, and we're going to compare it to the narrative. Demeanor, how the witness looked, acted, and spoke while testifying. A witness who is evasive, hostile, or acting suspiciously may be less credible. Now, we can't look at the disciples, but we can gather from the text and from history some things. The disciples are recorded as running and hiding at the arrest of Jesus. They are shown hiding and living in fear at the time of his resurrection. But post-resurrection, they show an extreme and uncharacteristic boldness that could only happen if they experienced something miraculous. They went from running and hiding and living in fear to literally putting their lives on the line. Peter stood up amongst thousands of Jews after 60 days before, less than 60 days, denying Christ, and then hiding and going back to his old life of fishing. And then he stands up at Pentecost and preaches, and I think it was 5,000 people or something like that were added to the church. I always forget if it was the 5,000 or 15 or there's a lot of people, right? And really within the first few chapters of Acts, this happens multiple times with Peter. Peter's thrown in jail and he comes back bold. John is thrown in jail and comes back bold. We see this drastic turn in their lives, in their character, and in their demeanor. Consistency, whether the witness's statements are consistent when describing events. This one, really, the book of Luke is the key here. The best example of this is Luke. Due to the detail of the account in the book of Acts, historians have determined that Luke is a very accurate author and on par with Josephus in his non-miraculous events. Okay? Now, Luke maintains his style of writing and amount of detail in his recordings of miraculous events in Acts, and both miraculous and non-miraculous events in Luke. This level of consistency should lead us to believe Luke to be a reliable witness. So this is how this works. Most people, if they want to sell a story, they're going to hyper-focus on key events, right? So if I say, well, I was walking through the gym the other day, and I happened to be wearing some cool shoes, and I picked up a basketball, and I took 15 steps, I jumped as hard as I could, leapfrogged over a guy, and I did a backwards dunk. All right, first off, that's not believable in any world. But second, I brushed over the verifiable facts. And then I was hyper detailed on the lesson, the miraculous part, right? The fact that I could leapfrog over anyone or dunk, okay? Luke doesn't do that. Luke gives you dates, times, places, shipping routes from this city to this city to this city, and they match shipping routes of the time that we have from people like Josephus and Tacitus. And historians have been able to take all of the non-miraculous events because of the amount of detail and say, yeah, Luke is accurate in these, and his storytelling is exactly the same when it comes to miraculous events. He doesn't brush over them, and he doesn't go into crazy amounts of additional detail beyond the normal. He's the same all the way through. And then they take that from Acts and they say Luke is exactly the same as Acts. We know that's written by the same author, and we see consistency. So Luke is what we call a consistent witness. Any questions on that? Did I kind of relay that clear enough? All right. Next, memory. How well the witness remembers and describes what happened. Even if they can't remember perfectly, they should be confident and honest about what they remember. The oldest cold case in America was over 50 years past its events when it was solved. The Gospels were only written around 30 to 35 years after the events, okay? So what's that tell us? That tells us if we can close a cold case today and rely on witness memory and rely on things at that stage, then we should have no trouble trusting the Gospels that are 60% of that time, right? And then we talked last week, we said low frequency, high impact events are scientifically shown to be more memorable and reliable. So the fact that the authors of the gospel experienced these incredible things and these witnesses, they didn't spend a ton of time. I'm 30 years old, right? Or 32. So roughly right in that time frame. All right. So from the time of my birth to now, my dad can still recall a lot of things very clearly, a lot older than I am, all right? Memories from long before I was born. My sister and brother remember things from long before I was born with great detail. It should be no problem to trust that their memories, especially of low frequency, high impact events, miracles, the wonderful things that are recorded that we see Jesus do, should be no shock that they can recall that 30 to 35 years later. Bias. Whether the witness has a personal relationship with the victim, which they obviously did, or has been given a special deal by the prosecution, which they didn't. In fact, if we were to consider the prosecution to be the Pharisees or the Sanhedrin who wanted the Christian movement shut down, the Romans who wanted the Christian movement shut down, we would say that the disciples actually did not have a special deal from the prosecution. While the disciples may have been biased in wanting Jesus to rise from the dead, it was actually not beneficial for them in any way to spread the message of the resurrection in Israel. And we're going to come back to that in the main part of our case for the resurrection. Prior statements. Whether the witness has been inconsistent or has made inconsistent statements about important events in the past. With the Gospels being among the last written books of the New Testament, if they conflicted with the testimony of the disciples, they would have been disregarded, as happened to many of the other accounts, such as the Gospel of Judas, the Gospel of Thomas, and the Gospel of James, and several other what we call Gnostic Gospels. Based on the church's early willingness to disregard accounts that did not line up, there is good reason to believe that the Gospels do match prior statements made by the disciples. So what we see is the disciples obviously spread the gospel. The church grew for 30 plus years. We get the Synoptic Gospels written about 20, 30 years later, we get the book of John. And then through the course of the next several hundred years, as the canonization is developing and things like that, these are the basis of the church, these testimonies, okay? They're compared, they're worked with other gospels and other potential writings, and they come back to realize these are the cornerstone. These line up. These have stood the test of time. They are consistent with what was taught to Polycarp, to Irenaeus, to Justin Martyr, to Origen, to these very early church fathers said these are, and we looked at this a lot last week, consistent. These are the pillars. These are this is the testimony of Christ. So we can trust that the Gospels, written 30 years later, accurately represented the testimony of the first few years and what was said, what was taught. So this brings us to our actual case for the resurrection. These are the arguments, okay? First and foremost, Jesus' death was confirmed by enemy attestation. The Romans confirmed his death. The disciples didn't claim that he died and rose again. Okay, the Romans confirmed his death. The Sanhedrin confirmed his death. They wanted his body off the cross. Okay, so we actually see this recorded in Scripture that the enemy confirmed his death. The Romans were masters of execution. Okay, they did not do false diagnosis. All right, the swoon theory that some will try to posit, well, he didn't really die. He just passed out, and the coolness of the cave revived him. Okay, let's examine that. He was beaten while blindfolded by professional fighters. He was whipped with a cat o' nine tails 40 times. Okay, and I have seen an artist rendition of what that beating alone looked like, and I'm going to tell you, I almost threw up. His ribs were hanging out, his flesh was hanging from his skin, from his bones, sorry. The muscles and ligaments would have been ripped from their connection points, from the tendons. The Bible says he was not recognizable as a human being. Then he was nailed to a cross where he asphyxiated, he bled out. Okay, you don't just get up a couple days later because of the coolness of a dirty cave. Okay, you wouldn't get out of a hospital a few days later in a sterile environment. You're not going to get up without infection and all of that. Okay, the swoon theory is absolutely preposterous. His death is, we can talk today and say that there are atheists that say he lived and died. Muslims will say he lived and died. Jews will say he lived and died. The very death of Jesus Christ is one of the most confirmed and believed facts across multiple religions, not even our own, multiple religions, and even atheism. But next, we see that the location of the message of the resurrection, okay? They preached this message in Jerusalem. Okay, they didn't run to Galilee where maybe there were a bunch of people who didn't see him die and say, hey, he rose again. They didn't run out to the Decapolis. They didn't run out to the other Roman areas right away. They went right to the place where people saw him die and said, he's risen. That's where the church started. That's where Pentecost was preached, at the very steps of the house of the people who put him to death. The very Sanhedrin that put the Roman seal there could have presented a body. Okay, but yet, very few, if any, challenged whether the body was gone. Now, we did try to see a cover-up, right? The Sanhedrin told the Romans, well, saying that the disciples came and overpowered you. And we're going to see why that's not a very good excuse. But the very fact that they went right back into what would be called an enemy territory, this would be the hardest place to get a convert. Okay? If you see me beaten and bloodied and killed in this church, and then you know that everyone in this church hates me, you're not going to come right back here and say, hey, he's alive again. Right? That's kind of a little weird. You might be like, hey, let's go down to Gallatin. Like, they might be a little more accepting of our mission there, okay? If they're lying, this isn't the place to start. So now we're going to look at the fact that the likelihood of a lie is incredibly, incredibly low. First and foremost, the disciples believed in what they were preaching to the point they were willing to be tortured and to die for their testimony. Now, this in and of itself does not make it true, okay? This signifies that they believed it to be true, okay? Muslims are willing to die for their faith. Buddhists are, I think, willing to die for their faith, okay? As Christians, we're willing to die for our faith. Jews are willing to die for their faith. Atheists, I've heard a couple off-the-wall stories of atheists who have died absolutely adamant there is no God. They are holding out till the end, okay? When you believe something to be true deep down, you're willing to experience pain for it. You're willing to die for it. Why? Because if it is verified fact that you are that sure of, you can't deny it. And when it has been that life-altering of an experience, you won't deny it. So it's not necessarily proof that the resurrection is true, but it is proof that they 100% believe that Jesus Christ rose from the dead. This is not something that they invented. But here's the other kickers. They included embarrassing details. Now, I don't know about you, but when my team wins a basketball game, I don't like to highlight my failures about the game, right? I don't like to go and talk about, well, yeah, I had 3 turnovers and they did get some breakaways, but my buddy, he stepped it up and got, no, I'm not going to tell you about my mistakes. I'm just going to talk about the fact that we came out on top, all right? But what do the Gospels do? They talk about their failures. They talk about all the times that we hear, "Oh, ye of little faith." They talk about the women finding the tomb before they did, which was culturally a thing that they wouldn't want to happen. They talk about their denial in the garden. They talk about Peter's denial at the trial. Okay? All of these things, these are embarrassing moments that don't put them in a good light. And because they're willing to include that, that automatically raises the level of what we would call reliability. And lastly, they had nothing to gain. They stood absolutely, there was no fame, there was no fortune, there was no prosperity. Look at any other religion. Joseph Smith, I don't know if he died wealthy, but he had, I can't say that with young ears, he had a lot of worldly fun. Look at Muhammad. He had slaves, he had a harem. Okay, all of these other people who start these religions, these people who live on lies, these cultists who go and they start their own communes, right? What's the guy's name? Jones? The Kool-Aid guy? Right? He had power. He had money coming in. Look at the Church of Scientology. Okay? This is evidence that the leaders, they're standing with something to gain. The apostles didn't have that. Sure, there were thousands and thousands of followers, but there was always persecution. There was always pain. There was always someone coming against them. Paul had beating after beating after beating, kicked and thrown out of cities. And we see this, that the gospel spread because of persecution and the truth endured. In fact, this is a little bit small, but let's look at some of this. Most of this is, some of this is confirmed. Two of these are obviously confirmed through, or one of these is confirmed in Scripture. Others we have prophecies of, but a lot of this is confirmed through early church fathers, and it's what we might call church tradition. James, the son of Zebedee, around AD 44, so less than 15 years after the resurrection, was beheaded by King Herod. Simon Peter, sometime between 64 and 68 AD, was crucified upside down on a cross in Rome. Andrew, the brother of Peter, was tied to an X-shaped cross and hung for days on that cross. Because he wasn't nailed, it was just tied up there. And as he hung, the record says that he preached the entire time. He preached the gospel. Philip, the evangelist, was around 80 AD, was hung in Turkey. Nathanael ministered in Armenia and was flayed to death with knives in India. Thomas, some say Matthew the tax collector, some records say he may have had a natural death, but there is also a record that says that he died by the sword in Ethiopia. Thomas also possibly had a natural death, but the record states that he died by a spear in India. James the Less was stoned or clubbed to death. Some say both, that he was cast out of the temple and stoned, and then they saw he was still alive and came and beat him with clubs. Thaddeus was martyred in Persia via arrows. Simon the Zealot was crucified. The Apostle Paul was beheaded in Rome shortly after the fire of Rome, right around 64 to 68. James, the brother of Jesus, a Christ denier who became a convert after his resurrection and leader in the church, was stoned in Jerusalem. And John the Beloved was boiled in oil, survived, exiled to Patmos, and then released to Ephesus to live out his days, the only one confirmed to have died of natural causes. I'm going to tell you one more story, because obviously these men believed what they said, what they taught, what they witnessed. But that's just the first generation of Christians. There's a man named Polycarp. Last week we presented several quotes from Irenaeus. Polycarp was the teacher of Irenaeus, and Polycarp was a disciple of John the Beloved. History tells us that Polycarp was condemned to death. He was placed in an arena and said, "Appeal to Caesar and deny your atheism." Now, in the Roman world, to be an atheist meant you just didn't hold to either Judaism or to the Roman gods, okay? So it didn't mean the atheists say we don't believe in God. It just meant you didn't hold to the pantheism and you didn't fall under the exception of Judaism because of everything that happened with the Greek war. They decided not to fight it. They just gave an exception. So the Christians, caught in this middle ground, were deemed by the Romans to be atheists. And Polycarp said, no, I absolutely deny atheism. And what he meant is, I deny everyone who doesn't hold to the one true God. And they said, now appeal to Caesar, submit to Caesar. He wouldn't do it. And I believe the story goes that they lit him on fire and he didn't burn. And they had to come up with a secondary form of execution. I don't remember, but I believe he was beheaded. Okay, these men, their testimony, their lives were so powerful. Their testimony and the way they lived, the words they said, the memories that they shared were so strong that second and third generation Christians went to their deaths in much the same way we read up here. I think it was Paul even mentioned some were thrown to lions. We know that they were cast into the various coliseums and arenas and used for more or less fodder for the entertainment. There are story after story because, again, Rome didn't really accept Christianity until the 3rd or 4th century. And so these first generations of Christians, if you want to read some of those stories, go to The Voice of the Martyrs. Absolutely incredible. Tells a lot of these stories, tells the stories of these men as well as just those early generations, how they suffered, were beaten, there were miracles, and more often than not we read that they continued testifying till their dying breath. They continued sharing God's love. They didn't curse the one that was killing them. They didn't beg for their lives. The stories go that they loved and they served and they were faithful to the end. And these testimonies should speak of the power of the gospel because Gamaliel said in Acts 11? No, it's before that. So I believe it was before Paul came on the scene. He said, if this movement is of God, you don't want to stand against God. And you won't be able to stop it. And if it's of men, then it'll fall on its own. And for centuries before it was accepted by the Roman Empire, their message flourished and grew despite the pain, despite the persecution, despite the suffering, despite the backlash from both Judaism and the Romans. There was no friendly side for them. They lived their lives, many of them in hiding, many of them in fear, growing carefully. But what do we see throughout early Acts? The gospel spread because of persecution. It wasn't squandered. It wasn't squashed. The enemy could not prevail, just as Jesus promised. And it grew and grew and grew. Why? Because of one thing, the resurrection. I don't have my Bible with me. Acts 15. Sorry, not Acts 15. 1 Corinthians 15. One of the most powerful, it's often considered to be one of the first creeds of the church. And in there, Paul says that for us, the hope of the resurrection is the linchpin, because he said, if Christ be not raised from the dead, then we are of all men most foolish. If this point is not true, everything else doesn't matter. The Sadducees didn't believe in the resurrection. The Zealots probably didn't care. But Jesus said, I am the resurrection and the life. Only through him could death be overcome. Only through the work that he did on the cross was he able to conquer death and reign in what was the natural consequence of our sin. And because of that, we have hope. Because of that, we have restoration with the Father. Because of the resurrection, we love to talk about the death and the pain and the suffering that Jesus bore. But it is this moment in history that the gospel hinges on, because if he didn't rise from the dead, nothing else mattered. It didn't matter if he died 1,000 times. Well, he could die 1,000 times without rising. But It didn't matter if he died exactly as was prophesied or not. It didn't matter if he lived a sinless life or not, because if he didn't come back from the dead, death wasn't conquered. But it was. And their lives, the reliability of the gospel that we talked about last week, and the testimony of their deaths, their pain, their suffering, still speaks today to say, this is the truth. This is reliable. This is believable. And we should hold to that and cling to that. And it should not just be something we rely on, but it should be empowering. When Jesus said, there was two key statements in the Gospels. But he looked at Peter and said, on this rock I'll build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. We read that in English as if they're attacking us. But in the Greek, it actually reads opposite. When it says the gates of hell shall not prevail, it's not saying that we're on defense. It says they're not going to be able to stop us. The hope of the resurrection should propel us into action, propel us into sharing the gospel, propel us into faithfulness, propel us into obedience because of love. Right? It's what keeps the church moving forward. We're not a defensive fortress. We're to be going out into the world and sharing the gospel because of this moment, because of this proof, this testimony. And I believe the other one said that in John 1, it said the light shined in darkness and the darkness could not overcome it, or some translations say comprehended it not. But again, it's the same thing, that the light was moving in an offensive direction. It's moving forward and conquering, and the darkness couldn't stop it. And we see that lived out in these men's lives. And because of their testimony, we can trust that the word of God is true, that their testimony that was given in the Gospels is true, that the conversion of the Apostle Paul, who went from persecuting the church to one of its biggest forces, in my opinion, one of the greatest Christians to ever live, 180 degrees, because he saw the risen Christ. And that, to me, is the case for the resurrection. Now, there are people that can give this case a lot better than I can with a lot better evidence. Obviously, cold case Christianity. J. Warner Wallace was a cold case detective who was an atheist, and he said, you know what, I've been closing cold cases all my career. I think I should actually go and investigate this. And you can actually see some of his testimony at coldcasechristianity.com. You can read the book Cold Case Christianity, but he thought the evidence of the eyewitness testimonies was enough to convert him from an atheist to a Christian. The Case for Christ by Lee Strobel. Lee Strobel was another atheist who was an investigative journalist, and he investigated a lot of cases and things like that. And so he thought, you know what, I'm going to put these skills to use, and I'm going to prove Christianity false. And he became a convert. Another great book, very easy to read, very comprehensible. Ethan, this is one that I was going to use as a textbook for our class. It's that understandable, like it could be used in a high school setting. Core Facts by Braxton Hunter. Braxton is the president of a seminary in Indiana, and I don't remember how the acronym works fully, but basically the book is divided into two parts. Each part is divided into two parts. So the first half of the book is the case for God and the case for the resurrection. The word core is an acronym for his 4 arguments for God, and the word facts is his 5-point case for the resurrection. The second half of the book, he actually deals with the objections to his arguments and gives answers to those. So very, very well written, very easy to read. So I do highly recommend that book. That said, that's everything I've got for tonight. I know we're about 20 minutes early. So if anyone has thoughts, questions, comments, I forget what we were talking about before, but we can go back to that. But that is our lesson for tonight. Yes?
I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
What would you say to someone who said, what about the other people in other religions who are raised that way their whole life, having God send them to hell?
That's a great question. I don't want to spoil too much of next week because next week we are doing the how does a loving God send people to hell, which is a common question, as well as the 3 views of hell. But largely, I would say first and foremost, in our arguments for God, we talked about how God left himself a witness in nature. And specifically in Romans 2. Now, there are many who don't agree with what I'm about to say, but there is an argument for what's called the argument for inclusion. And Paul says that when those without the law do by nature what is in the law, they are a law unto themselves, and God will judge them accordingly. If you're familiar at all with The Last Battle in C.S. Lewis, there is a character there. I don't remember what his nationality was, but basically he was not Narnian, right? And he served a false god. Well, that god was evil. Everything about him, and C.S. Lewis seems to write him very similar to what we understand to be Allah. Well, he ends up in the afterlife. And this man, is from what we can tell, was upright. He just didn't know who Aslan was. And he ends up in the end, and I think it was Peter asked him, he says, why is he here? He didn't serve you. And he said, well, everything that he did that was good. Because Tash, the evil god, there's nothing good about Tash. He said, everything that he did was good, he did to me. He did for me. Now, Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. John 1 says, in the beginning was the Word was with God, the Word was God, the same was in the beginning with God. All things were made by him, and without him was not anything made that was made. I personally believe, because of what Romans 2 teaches, that when someone who has never heard the name of Christ looks at the handiwork of the Creator, says there must be a God, they recognize the moral law that God has written on their hearts, and they pursue God, that he looks at that, and just as he did with Abraham, and said, that is faith in me, and he honors that. Now, that is my opinion. I believe it's biblically based. There are many who would disagree with that. There are people who strictly believe that if you don't call on the name of Jesus Christ, you will not be saved. In my opinion, if you recognize the work of the painter, then you're recognizing the painter himself. So when you look at creation and you recognize that that is God, that there must be a God who is above all things, who created all things, and it points you in your heart to one God, okay? You're not getting caught up in all the pantheism and all the crazyism and, not pantheism, well, pantheism, yes, but polytheisms. I think there is a path of righteousness for those who don't hear the name, okay? Now, I have had people ask me, well, then why should we share the gospel? Because that is kind of one of the potential pitfalls of this. So I would ask you this. Would you rather have a surety or a chance? Would you rather have no hope, or would you rather have hope and a purpose in life? You see, because by knowing Jesus Christ, we are given a name, we're given a heritage, we're given assurance, we're given a mission, we're given guidance, we're given peace that passes all understanding. I don't have to hope that I'll see my loved ones, okay? My wife's had 2 miscarriages. I don't have to guess whether I'll see my children that I never got to hold. I don't have to guess whether I'll get to meet my grandmother who lived as a vegetable until I was in 9th or 10th grade and passed away. I'll get to know her. I have meaning and purpose in Jesus Christ, and I have confidence that I will get to see them again, that I'll get to be with him. God gives, I think, people a chance because they don't know. They've never heard what we've heard. And there's a very good argument, I believe, continued in Romans, that where there is no knowledge, okay, where there's no knowledge of sin, there's no accountability for sin. I believe that's Romans 7. So, to me, I still think it's far better to share the gospel with someone. I think it's far more loving to share the gospel because I want the world to have that same hope, that same peace, that same purpose in life. Atheism often leads to nihilism and hopelessness. And this is why we see a rise in, again, I have to be careful what words I use. I don't even know a good way to make that a euphemism. Self-harm and worse. Okay? People are hopeless. They look around the world and they see darkness. And Jesus is the answer to that. He is the light that overcame in the beginning. He is the light that lights the lights of all men, lights the hearts of all men. And he wants us to be reflections of that light and to give people that same hope. And that in and of itself is a vital mission. Otherwise, we're not the church that he came to plant. We're not the church that's on the move, that's being on the offense. So I still think it is far, far better. And I think it's far necessary that we share the gospel, even if there is a chance that those who don't hear, I don't want my children to live on a chance. I'd rather than live on a surety. It's a very good question.
Yeah, I've actually been asked that question as well, but I always go to Matthew 24:14. You know, where Jesus, and that's what I was looking at, where Jesus says, the good news of the kingdom will be proclaimed in all the world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. So I take that as saying that the gospel will go to the ends of the earth.
Sure.
And then the end will come. So there is no excuse of saying that they've never heard of.
And there are several other passages that talk about God's witness to everyone, so that those who even haven't heard the name will be without excuse, because the goal is to come to the Father. Jesus is the way to the Father. I just don't personally believe that bowing our head and saying a prayer is the only way to Christ. I think it's the sure way to Christ. And I don't believe that all roads lead to Christ either. Please don't misunderstand what I'm saying. The road is narrow, and many will miss it. But I do think that there is a way, as C.S. Lewis did, right? He looked at morality and he said, how do I know that a stick is crooked if I hadn't seen a straight one? And that said there must be a God. He looked at nature and the things and the way that mankind acted, and that was his witness, just as the Bible said, that there was a witness and God's majesty and glory was proclaimed to all the world. Good questions. Any other thoughts?
I think you had a good argument there.
Yeah.
I would also point to, thinking about Old Testament examples, like prior to Christ even walking the earth, we know that people were saved.
Oh, yeah.
Like they didn't know Jesus, the name, but Abraham believed God and righteousness was credited to him. So even though
it was still based on faith.
it was based on faith and based on faith in God, and even though he didn't know that name, even though he hadn't said that prayer, that we call the magic prayer.
Hebrews 11 is full of those stories.
That's a hall of fame of the faithful.
And even look at people like Rahab, right? Rahab hadn't heard the name of Jehovah. All she had heard was the Israelites. And she knew that God was on their side, and she didn't want to stand against that. And what happened? She became the great, I think it was like great-great-great-great-grandmother of David, and is in the lineage of Christ. So God has always made himself known, or a way to make himself known.
But I would emphasize, like you did, but just emphasize it doesn't relieve the responsibility that we have to listen to the command that he gave us to spread the gospel and the good news. It doesn't mean that just take the easy route and say all paths lead to God, and you did.
Yeah. Because they don't all lead to God, but and again, I think assurance is far better than a chance. And when I say assurance versus a chance, I don't mean like assurance versus a 50% chance. I mean assurance versus like a less than 3% chance, probably. And it's probably smaller than that. Okay? We can have full assurance of the future with God, or we can, I hope, it's another Dumb and Dumber moment. There's still a chance.
But it is probably something you want to be tactful when you speak to that person, because people immediately shut their ears if you just say you're going to hell. It's not going to end well.
I think also the question that you used kind of at the beginning. I think when you're speaking with somebody that already has beliefs that are different from our own, a lot of it is just trying to delve into why do you believe that? How does if you believe in any type of an afterlife, how does your religion get you there?
Yep.
Because most people that we encounter overseas, they may have a faith in name, but most of them don't really even understand. And they're the same for a lot of people here. They don't really understand why they call themselves a Christian. In the same way that they may not always understand, it's just it's who we are. but then when you delve into their actual belief system, you can start presenting that ideas too.
There's a book, and I'll have to ask my dad which one it is. But this guy talked about when you go into a culture. My dad was a missions pastor for 10 years, and we were on the field for 5. About finding, I think he called it the scapegoat or something like that. You go in, you work within the culture to find that gospel element. Because it's insane how many other cultures have this element, this belief of something that takes away their sin, of something that does that atonement before the gods, right? And then you use that, you find that common ground and build off of it. Now, there was one crazy story where this guy went and preached the gospel, and the actual culture actually really liked when someone was a traitor, like very survival of the fittest, and so Judas was the hero to them. And the big missionary was like, no, not right. But I would say 19 times out of 20, you're going to find that there is something already there that you can use to talk to them, to find that common ground, because the best lies don't run contrary to the truth. They run parallel. If I want to sit in that chair, I don't have to walk this way. You don't have to pull me this way to get me to miss. You just got to get me to go here. Okay? Then the devil is a master. So he doesn't need you. If you ever, another great book, Screw Tape Letters by C.S. Lewis, it's a series of letters from a one demon to another, but they're set up as uncle and nephew, right? So the uncle is like this higher level demon, and the nephew is on assignment. And there's this guy, he's like, we don't want him to become a Christian. He goes, and there's a statement, Screw Tape is, I think, the nephew, and Wormwood is the uncle. I could have that backwards, it's been a few years. But he says, we don't need him. He said, we don't want him to convert, but we don't need him out of the church. Let him be just religious enough that he thinks he's okay. Let him be there. Let him give. Let him do good works. Just keep him from this. By the way, you've mentioned a few of his vices. Let's just work those in. And then he gets saved. He says, okay, you have failed at this mission, but now let's keep him from being any good to the enemy. It's a fascinating read, and it's very fun because it really puts the mindset of how deception works. You don't have to take them 180 degrees off course. You just need them to miss the mark. And because of that, there's an inherent flaw that says, okay, if you're moving parallel to me, I just need you to not get on the exit, right? If we're in the same road, we're both going to Nashville, don't get off on Old Hickory Boulevard. This is where you're headed. Let me get you out of that exit only lane and let's go the right way. So we can use the commonalities that Satan has worked into his lie to pull people back. Anybody else? All right. Thank y'all for coming. Next week will be our last week, and we're going to tackle the 3 views of hell and what historically the church has held to as punishments, and then also kind of answer the question, how can a loving God send someone to hell? All right. Thank you so much.